Dear Professor Tridimas, thank you for inviting the invitation to present at the Adam Smith seminar. We are very honored that you are there, and Peter and I have the privilege to introduce you to this event. We'll discuss democracy and democratic decision making today, and of course, it is of very big importance. The question: will we give the power to govern us? And indeed, it's for that reason important that we academics come out of our ivory tower and give suggestions how to do so.
Yes, well, and as academics should leave their ivory tower, so do politicians sometimes leave their ivory tower as well. And well, Klaas and I are both Dutch, and we think a very nice example is the Dutch government, who instated a state commission to evaluate the functioning of the democracy in the Netherlands. And well, based on these investigations, the commission made several recommendations how to improve the democratic process. And well, Professor Tridimas, we are very happy that you will now share your thoughts on, as you call it, as we can see on the first slide, the inflated expectations of democracy. Because when Klaas and I were actually studying the recommendations made by the State Commission in the Netherlands, we know that many ideas from academics around the world were in fact incorporated in their recommendations. So we feel this really stresses the importance of, well, of your work and your thoughts that you will be sharing with us in this Adam Smith seminar.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I would repeat the importance of the topic that you are talking about, democracy. Who are we giving and how do we govern ourselves, so to say. And let's hope that we academics can make some positive contributions in how the process is working. I think you have about an hour. People can ask questions in the chat, and afterwards we hope there is time to have a discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You've just made my life even more difficult than it was before. When you approached me with Manfred, with a suggestion of saying something about improving democracy, I thought I was in hot water. Now I am in something which is very close to hell. So hot is the water. It's I find it extremely difficult. It's a daunting task to actually make suggestions, policy recommendations, or recommendations for institutional change. I gave it a go, let's say. I looked at various issues. So I think what I've come up with is something which we can consider as a synthesis, primarily of what we as political economists have found out, know about the institutions of democracy, how they changed over time. And I will venture a little bit with some kind of recommendations or suggestions for reform, if you like. So democracy today, probably the best way to look at it is to go back to Lincoln. Democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people. How do you understand it today? The central procedure of democracy is elections. Lots of complaints, shortcomings, lots of problems as we are now on 2021. Here is another quotation: democracy, modern democracy is riddled with holes. Modern democracy is in a way remote from the citizens. So what I've got in mind for today is actually to talk a little bit about the appeal of democracy, what is so good, why it has become so desirable, a list of shortcomings or dissatisfaction with democracy and the litany of complaints. Then what I think is the strong actually clause of the political economist, explanations of the dissatisfaction with democracy coming from the political economy, more general economics literature, and a few suggestions, what I call remedies, and a very short conclusion. So, to begin with, why democracy? What is the appeal of democracy? Probably we should go back to where it all started from. Democracy comes from the ancient Greek word demokratia, two words here: demos, meaning people, citizens; kratos, kratos means have power. So democracy, in its original conception definition, means the form of government where people have power. first invented and practiced with ancient Greece, specifically with Athens coming to its apogee then. Now, I hasten to add that over the last few years, there has been an increasing literature, growing actually, a literature of contributions which say that, well, actually, democracy was not really invented by the Greeks. There was democracy practiced before the Greeks. And when exactly the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, started, it's a very nice debate. However, I will follow the kind of standard wisdom at this moment that democracy was invented and practiced first by the Greeks. Then democracy died. After the expansion of the Greek world with Alexander the Great to what was the eastern side of the Mediterranean lands, with the kingdoms, Hellenistic kingdoms coming in, and then Rome, democracy as it was understood by the ancient Greeks died away. It reappears much later, and the modern democracy is one where the government, the ruler actually, is legitimated by the consent of the ruled. So we look at democracy and we say election of rulers is actually what offers consent to the ruler by the people. And that, as an idea, is not actually that modern. It goes back to the Middle Ages, and that famous quote. I'm not going to try my Latin here, which really means that that which touches all shall be approved by all. In other words, individuals are obliged to follow only what they have consented to. With that idea, eventually we come up to modern democracy. But modern democracy is indeed modern representative government, and it was conceived in opposition to the ancient democracy. People have power, but today modern representative government is actually the type of democracy we follow, we practice, and to some extent we preach. But we have democracy with adjectives. So we talked about direct democracy for the ancient Greeks, indirect, even the ancient Greeks had actually different ways of looking at their democracy, how extreme it was, or whether it was moderated, and so on. Nowadays, we talk about liberal democracy, and liberal democracy confers rights to the individual. By that, we mean that individuals have various freedoms and an independent judiciary which protects and enforces those freedoms. Equality in modern democracy is obtained, materializes through the one person, one vote, and therefore the majority rule. Elections, competitive, fair, and recurring elections, select the best to govern, and it is the people who decide who the best are. This is actually the setting. This is how we look at democracy today, as representative democracy and democracy which gives representative government. Now, why democracy? What are the arguments for democracy? We can actually distinguish between intrinsic value of democracy and instrumental value of democracy. When I talk about intrinsic value, then the come to mind freedom. Individuals are not compelled. Individuals are free to choose, free to decide. Equality, all citizens have equal say to public policy making. The people are the final arbiters over every policy, and therefore the legitimacy of government actually stands on these on the decisions of the people. All this put together implies something which is like a desirable aspect of it, an ethical aspect of it, dignity to the individual. Why? Because the preferences of the individual are respected. Coming to the instrumental value of democracy. Instrumental value of democracy is, from the record that we have, at least looking at the standard Western democracies, over the long term, the democracy of the Western type has delivered stability, prosperity, and peace. Okay, when we look at democracy and try to analyze it, Aiken and Bartels have suggested that there are two approaches to modern democracy, modern representative government. The first is what they call really the populist, not populism, but populist ideal of democracy, where ordinary citizens determine the policies of the democratic democratic communities. And they call that the folk theory of democracy. And it really is the idea that people as voters are wise, informed, engaged in politics, and what the majority wants becomes government policy after voting either in representative elections or voting in referendums. There is a reduced format, and that's a second approach to democracy, a reduced format, which is actually what they call the leadership selection model, where voters punish politicians who fail to deliver good policies. This idea of democracy is based on what they call retrospective theory of voting, where election outcomes depend on the degree of voters' approval of actual performance of incumbent politicians. So the idea here is that we vote rascals out when they prove to be rascals, but we reward them if they've done a good job. Okay, this is the appeal of democracy. Now, defects of democracy, or the litany of complaints. We can go all the way back to Plato. Democracy degenerates to mobocracy, the rule of the mob, which results in anarchy, and therefore it will be followed by tyranny to reestablish order, and so on. So democracy is out because democracy eventually is corrupted to mobocracy. More recently, we've got if you like, the 21st century critique and criticism of democracy. Democracy is inaccessible and unresponsive to citizens. Democracy may be broad, but it is thin. That is, citizens express their vote and express their opinions only sporadically. The exercise of freedom is freedom to choose is discontinuous, sporadic, and so on. Citizens have become human democratic goods. They expect the government and the bureaucracy to respond to complex problems, and they leave it to that. More recently, of course, we have the complaints that democracy has lost control to corporate power. Representative democracy has empowered an elite of politicians, business people, probably other influential opinion makers from the arts, from the media, from this and that and the other one. As a result, a gap opens between the promises of popular government and the persistence of personal connections at the top of the pyramid of rulers. And this gap actually then, in truth, drives populism. It is this actually gap which leads to the accusation that democracy has been stolen from the people by the elites. Now, populists tend to deny the legitimacy of established parties. They attack them as undemocratic and sometimes as unpatriotic. And populism actually lives on, in fact, thrives on conspiracy theories regarding the gap between the rulers and the ruled, and that further undermines confidence in democracy. So, can you explain this dissatisfaction? Can you explain the shortcoming of democracy? Our economic theory, and especially political economy, offers a number of explanations, and I've structured them along those actually 5 headings. So, here we go. First of all, as we know for a very long time, starting with Arrow, the democratic outcomes are not consistent. We've got the problem of cyclicity because of multidimensional decision space, or actually these two go together, non-single picked preferences. There is no proposal which commands a majority against all other proposals. Unless, of course, we start imposing restrictions, like some individual preferences are excluded, or choice is left to a single individual, that is a dictator, or we impose an arbitrary structure on choices, that is agenda setting. Probably none of them is that appealing. If we believe that none of those actually restrictions makes sense, is appealing, then the general will of the voters cannot be discovered by a procedure which simply counts individual preferences, like voting in whatever form and so on. So, is this the end? Of course not. In practice, we set up institutions which lead to structure-induced equilibriums. However, institutions affect incentives, which then affect efficiency, and institutions determine property rights, which affect distribution. And if we do not like the outcomes which those institutions generate, then we turn against the institutions and the institution of democracy. So that is the issue of impossibility of the social choice equilibrium as a shortcoming of democracy in the way that we understand democracy. Now, second issue, second reason for the shortcomings, for the litany of complaints. Do voters have well-defined preferences? Here is a quote from Aiken and Bartels, and the answer is actually no, they don't. Voters are too busy with their own lives, and they are not well informed, and they are not actually forming preferences which will therefore be aggregated to give us an outcome, and so on and so forth. Some corroborating evidence is from the framing of effects, that is, with different wording to a question of the same issue, they getting actually different answers. And if this is the case, then it becomes questionable whether citizens have well-defined preferences, which are then aggregated as inputs to the collective choice outcomes. So it goes out of the window to try and aggregate individual preferences, because those preferences are not defined. Along with that comes the third issue, which is the question that even if we believe that preferences can be well defined, voters are imperfectly informed. Political issues are too complex for most of voters to understand. Voters are ignorant about how much they know. Indeed, they are ignorant about how little they know. And lacking this knowledge, they gravitate towards simplistic solutions. So voters are not able to evaluate sensibly whether they have good, let's say, they live under good economic outcomes, and how far this good economic or bad economic outcome is the responsibility of the incumbent government. So it now becomes questionable whether citizens are wise, informed, and engaged in politics, as the folk theorem assumes. And here I would like to bring a kind of a paradox. In the age of internet and social media, a proliferation of news sources is available, but it has made actually harder to know what is really going on. Why? What is going on? Why is it the case that with more actually news sources and more access, easier access to news, we don't know what is going on? As bounded rationality actually tells us, people seem to gravitate towards what they want to hear, so they do not become any wiser, they do not become any more informed. That voters are imperfectly informed is something which is like an old hat. We know that for a long time, and we know its implications. That is rational ignorance, which says that for the individual, with information costly to acquire and the probability that the individual casts a vote which is decisive, being negligible, the rational voter remains ignorant. Unless, of course, this rational voter expects large personal benefits. So, why bother? Well, we do bother because political entrepreneurs, politicians who wish to win the election, have a strong incentive to provide information to voters. So, voters vote for political representatives. Political representatives are organized in political parties which solve problems of collective action and collective choice. That's the source here for explaining all those things, Aldrich, 1995. Now, with representative democracy, we have the agency relationship, or the delegation relationship, if you prefer, between voters and politicians. Let me make a small digression here on the notion of representation. There are two notions of representation. One is what is known as descriptive or statistical representation, which is the pre-modern model, where the representative and the represented share the same identity. In fact, this can be traced back to Aristotle and Politics, his book on Politics. The modern notion is one of the trustee representation, where the representative is a trustee who must make her own judgment concerning the interests of the constituents and how best those interests can be served. There are two actually ideas in the trustship relationship. First, that the representative is a trustee under a mandate, and under a mandate means that the representative reflects the interests of the represented and decides in ways that the represented the representatives themselves would have decided had they been present at the point of deliberations and so on. The second model is the representative with full powers. Again, I'm not going to try my Latin. Representatives are independent of the representative and act as trustees in the interests of the nation. And representation with full powers was something which, in many respects, was pioneered and established in the UK. All right. Over to digression. Economic generates problems of adverse selection and moral hazard. So what is the adverse selection here? The adverse selection takes the following form. The politician is asking for my vote, and that makes me wonder what kind of person seeks office. That is a question which relates to the motivation, the honesty, and the competence of the candidate politician. The agency relationship generates a second problem, the problem of adverse incentive or moral hazard. And this is the question of politicians may exploit information advantages and the fact that they have discretionary powers because they occupy office, and they may use those powers to pursue their own interests, sometimes at the expense of the voters' interest. Specifically, that takes the form of politicians pursuing short-term objectives. Simply, politicians interested in winning the election pander to various ephemeral short-term objectives or pressures and ignore the long-run implications, welfare implications of their policies. So quick fix instead of thinking about the future. Representative democracy is actually voting for politicians organized in political parties, especially as we see it in the latter part of the 20th century. What does that mean? To begin with, voters vote for party platforms, and party platform means bundling of issues. So preference intensity for different issues cannot be recorded, cannot be shown. It's one vote for all sorts of different things. On the multidimensional issue of deciding policies is reduced into a vote, a cross actually next to a name. Voters choose politicians, then politicians decide. In other words, voters do not decide policy. Unlike what we saw before in the folk theorem of democracy, it is not voters who decide policy, it is politicians who decide policy. Politicians, coming back to representation, have neither full mandate nor full powers, but politicians actually have to tell the party line. They have to be faithful to their parties. Political parties. Now, ancient Athens was a democracy, but there were no political parties in ancient Athens. So it's a big difference, which sometimes is not actually, which is ignored in the literature, because we focus on modern democracy, where political parties are paramount. We can find lots of thinkers here who have actually asserted that modern democracy is actually competition in elections between parties. So democracy operates as competition between parties, but not as competition within parties. There is a parallel here when we look at the standard economic market outcomes. We always say that in the market there is competition between firms, but there is no competition inside the firms. So in democracy there is competition between parties, but there is no democracy inside parties. Runciman has come all the way to say that political parties were not meant to run as democracies. That somehow is not as strong a statement now as it was a few years back, because various actually parties now hold primaries for selecting party leaders. So this is a step towards party democracy, and it is supported by the folk theory of democracy we said before, that the voters become decisive. However, it does not resolve the problem of imperfect voter information for those who are not party members and so on. And we can see the problem here, really, because the committed party members may select a candidate with extreme views, and we end up with polarization and so on. So, with imperfect information and agency relationship, political leaders are better informed. So a number of problems may come up here. When politicians are lying, for example, they falsely accuse the state or the other parties and so on for stealing the election away from them and the like, they undermine public confidence in elections. But when citizens do not trust the electoral process, then citizens lose faith in democracy itself. So it becomes a degenerate issue. If I trust the politicians, then, and the politicians do not trust the system, I end up actually not trusting democracy. Another problem, again, very much for the 21st century, is that executive power is only weakly controlled, and elected leader may sometimes become an autocrat and behave like one, as we know various examples at this moment. In addition, with voters being imperfectly informed, then voters may not be able to discern the role of the government and the impact of external factors in shaping economic outcomes. So it may not be possible for the voters actually to understand how much of the good times is the success of government policies, how much of the bad times is actually the outcome of factors outside the control of the government. And if this is the case, then we realize that retrospective accountability is not working. Voters, in other words, do not vote to punish or reward parties which happened to preside over good economic times or bad economic times. Now, if citizens pay actually little attention to politics, then political outcomes and government policies will reflect the balance of power between special interest groups. Here comes actually Eichel and Bartels again, to argue that election outcomes are mostly just erratic reflections of the current balance of partisan loyalties. Wow. Then they propose a group theory of democracy where citizens are members of social groups, social identities, and group attachments determine their political loyalties. Then group and partisan loyalties, not policy preferences or ideologies, are the fundamental inputs in democratic politics. They determine outcomes. This is to say, voting is expressive rather than instrumental. When political parties represent not just policy differences, but ways of life, identity politics arrive, and identity politics fuel populist frustrations. So we can explain actually what we saw before with, I think, we can explain the complaints against democracy with this thinking that economic theory gives us. So let me move on to the fourth of the factors there, which is the issue of political inequality. By that I mean intra-voter inequality and intra-candidate inequality, two types of inequality. Now, we said that modern democracy is based on the idea of equality, one person, one vote. Democracy and voting are supposed to equalize power. The rich and the poor have one vote apiece. However, there is economic inequality between voters in the sense that rich people, large corporations, business associations, and the like have the ability and the means to fund politicians' campaigns and lobby them between elections, rent seeking, that literature, and so on. As a result, organized policy demanders get what they want at the expense of the unorganized groups. Again, another complaint against democracy. In addition, there is also voting inequality, which comes from, for historical reasons, constituency sizes differ. For historical reasons, we operate under a variety of electoral laws, rules like first past the post, proportional representation in one form or another, and so on, in truth, assign different weights to different votes. So some votes count more than others. The upshot here is that a party may end up winning the electoral vote, but having a minority in parliament. So, or the electoral college and so on. So again, we've got, if you like, justified complaints against the democratic outcome and the like. So this is to say that there is no equality between the voters. In addition, there is inequality between the candidates for office. What is going on here? Candidates for office have unequal chances of being elected to office, obviously because they offer different policy platforms. But in addition to that, as we know, valence issues matter. Voters may treat different candidates differently on any criterion they like. The looks, education, anything. The looks is one of them, or various values, honesty and the like. In addition, candidates themselves want to differentiate from each other and emphasize what makes them superior to their rivals, and therefore more suitable for office. So valence matters, and because of valence issues, candidates are unequal. In addition to that, there is inequality because different candidates have unequal financial resources, which act as barriers to entry into the political arena, and so on. Informing voters about policies and candidates is costly. Candidates with unequal resources have unequal chances for an electoral victory, distorting the level playing field of the contest. Indeed, we can go a bit further and understand that it is easier to collect from a small number of big contributions and therefore rely on big donors and reward them after election, which therefore explains the gap between voters and elite that we were talking about before. So, elections for representatives produce office holders who have characteristics superior to those of voters. They are wealthier, they are better networked, they are more educated, they are career politicians emerging through the party machine, and so on and so forth. Again, there is a gap between the voters and the governing elite. The upshot here, election is aristocratic, or as Aristotle put it, or elitist as we put it now. Quite interestingly, the word election and elite come from the same root, Latin root. So elections are actually elitist. The final item in the list, why we have so many, how can we actually explain there's so many complaints against democracy, is the ethical neutrality of aggregating preferences. That is the fallacy of conferring ethical qualities to majority voting. What do you mean by that? Now, democracy, majority voting, is a method of aggregating preferences and resolving disputes after competing for the hearts and minds of the electorate. If the process of aggregating preferences is fair and the voting outcome is considered as legitimate, is the outcome necessarily good from a normative viewpoint? That's a question that we raise. And the answer is no, not necessarily. But if it is not necessarily good from a normative viewpoint, because we have not agreed on any normative viewpoint, not yet anyway, then those who expect elections to produce moral outcomes will be disappointed. So do not expect majority voting to produce something which would be like ethical or desirable from a normative point of view. Here's an old quotation: democracy leads to legitimate government because a non-entrenched majority of citizens choose what to do. But this does not actually say that majority voting outcomes is morally legitimate or has any kind of moral force. In truth, and depending on what we consider as moral, the majority voting outcome may be sinister. For example, it may end up with oppressing a minority, abusing human rights, electing politicians who fight disastrous wars, and so on. The list can go on and on, but those three will actually capture it. So the key is a non-entrenched majority of citizens, but if there is a permanent minority, a racial minority or a religious minority or something like that, then democracy can quite easily actually end up oppressing that minority, and we wouldn't really call that outcome moral. So, since we talk about morality and ethical issues and so on, I would like to bring into the fore the issue of democratic norms. What do you mean by that? Start from the premise that constitutions are incomplete contracts. Why? Because of imperfect information about preferences, about technological changes, about external shocks, and so on. Constitutions can never be actually fully fledged complete contracts. They are incomplete contracts, and as we know, incomplete contracts can actually be supplemented with codes of behavior, what we may call norms, democratic norms in this case. A successful democracy relies on informal rules, which are not written in any laws. They are not part of the constitution, but they are widely known and respected. That comes from Levitsky and Ziblatt, the book on the death of democracy. So they call these unwritten norms, these codes of behavior, the soft guardrails of democracy, which prevent day-to-day political competition from devolving into a no-holds-barred conflict. They speak of two closely related fundamental norms of conduct. The first is mutual toleration. That goes as follows: as long as I consider my rival as playing by the constitutional rules, I accept my rival, and I accept that my rival has an equal right to exist, an equal right to power, and an equal actually power to govern if elected. The second norm is the norm of forbearance. The norm of forbearance is really the idea of patient self-control and restraint, not using all institutional prerogatives to the hilt, even if it is illegal. And I am not actually formally barred from using these norms. So just remember things like lock her up, lock her up. Just think of how I can go actually hounding my predecessor in office when I am from a different political party. For the authors, for Levitsky and Ziblatt, forbearance means courtesy and reciprocity. Some good examples from the UK. The UK, for a long time, was based on the idea of good chaps in government. The presumption that everyone involved is a gentleman and is bound by codes of honor. Counter example, again from the UK, the current Home Secretary has been shown, well, it has been shown that the current Home Secretary has bullied her staff, breaching ministerial codes. She has not resigned, and there has been no pressure from her boss, the Prime Minister, to resign. So in this respect, there is a discord between the unwritten rules of behavior in democracy and the actual conduct in democracy. So when we start breaking those rules, we end up with intense partisan polarization, which will break the norms of mutual tolerance and forbearance. Remedies. Okay, that was actually the most difficult part of preparing this presentation. Where do you start and where do you go? So a lot more modestly, I have a few things which are, if you like, obvious, and we know them well, and a few things which probably deserve some more discussion. So in the first instance, if we look at the problem of incomplete voter information, then the solution is to make sure that there is a free press, so that information can circulate freely and so on and so forth. That's an old hat, but it is still relevant. Equal access to political competition is the second one. We talked about the inequality. Now, that of course requires to reduce, or even better, actually to balance the influence of money in politics. How? Well, I don't have anything to offer here. It's a very big issue. Probably the UK has done something right by actually controlling very tightly party finances and very tightly actually campaign finances. And when we look at the other issue you mentioned before, that some voters are more equal, or some votes are more equal than others, then probably redesigning the electoral laws. There are two more suggestions, which I think deserve a little bit of attention: deliberation and policy making by randomly selected assemblies of citizens, which brings us to the issue of being represented and being a representative. These are it seems to me, issues that have actually attracted a lot of attention from academic circles at this moment. And there is a lot of discussion about, well, it has been actually, but more intensely over the last 20 years or so, about deliberation and about citizen juries or mini publics or randomly selected assemblies. So in the first instance, can deliberation actually give us a definite outcome? Can it take us out of the cyclicity and bring us to the median voter equilibrium? Let's try and find out actually what is deliberation. Here is a definition which I found, and I think if you give that definition, it will immediately put off the audience. Deliberation is a kind of communication that ideally induces reflection about preferences, beliefs, and values in a non-coercive fashion, and connects particular interests to more general principles. And my name is George, right? If we start definitions which are that difficult, then probably we will lose interest very quickly. Nevertheless, there are some key virtues that we understand. It's reciprocity, communicating in terms that others who do not share our points of view or framework of thinking can actually understand and accept. Okay, now there is a lot of hope that deliberation can actually can actually improve the quality of democratic politics and so on and so forth. In truth, what deliberation does is to reduce the complexity or the multidimensionality by introducing constraints on the issues to be discussed. It may then lead to the median voter outcome, right? So we make very much clear what it's all about. We reduce the complexity of the issue into, if you like, a single dimension. Henceforth, we can bring forward the median voter outcome. Nevertheless, as Aiken and Bartels actually pointed out, it is in this respect similar to adopting an agenda setting procedure. Deliberation reduces multidimensionality, but at the expense of some arbitrariness. And there is no easy escape out of the impossibility. But deliberation is one way. What for? And who is going to deliberate? Okay, deliberation for the median voter equilibrium, who by? And here is where the mini publics or the people's juries or the randomly selected assemblies come into the picture. But one thing at a time. In truth, they rely on a different aspect of democratic equality, that is equality of opportunity to hold public office. And this takes us back to classical Athens. Now, we said that modern representative government is predicated on the idea that those who are ruled have to give their consent. They will only be obliged to follow what they have consented to. So, one man, one vote means I have an equal chance to actually give my consent and therefore legitimate the government through majority voting. The equality of opportunity to hold office is a different idea about democracy, and that was actually the dominant idea in the classical Athenian democracy. So what is happening here? How can we get them? Appointment to office, specifically to the deliberative assembly, by shortition, by the use of lottery. We draw lots to appoint members to a variety of committees which will deliberate, or to assemblies which will deliberate again, and so on and so forth. In fact, there are some, there is actually some work by none other than prominent public choice theorist Danish Müller, which looks very much at this issue, and it is now an old paper, and not so often quoted, not as often quoted as his other work. However, the institutions of the direct democracy, of the Athenian direct type of democracy, by which I mean shortition in some public offices, a large number of assembly meetings per year, 40 actually, during the fourth century, majority voting in the assembly, absence of political parties, and the input of the popular courts, were an interlinked and consistent total. These aspects were interdependent, consistent with each other, and you could not kind of pick one of them up and say, right, that can work. If this is the case, if in other words, we look at the if we take our inspiration from ancient Athens and say, here is something which is quite nice and probably should try it, short issue in some public offices, I very much doubt where it's going to work. It may not be possible to pick and choose institutions, transplant them to modern societies, and expect them to work smoothly. That brings me to the last part of what we mean by saying, what I meant by saying remedies. Let's be honest here, institutional reform is in the hands of sitting politicians, barring, of course, a revolution which changes everything. So it is sitting politicians who will initiate, institute, and approve an institutional reform. Easy to understand that sitting politicians will always design the institutions which suit their interests. So if we're serious about democratic reform, we should not allow constitutional framers to participate in constitutional politics. It's okay for them to work within the constraints, but not decide the constraints, because they will actually, if you like, rig them. I would consider that as fat chance that is not going to happen. So with that thought, let me move on to the concluding part. And here is how the ancient Athenians looked at democracy. Right? This is from Thucydides' funereal oration of Pericles. It's the speech that the Athenian Democrat Pericles gave after the first year of the Peloponnesian War. And it's this statement: it is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. One may raise issues here. What does he mean, administration? He means actually government. Administration, I think it is, I'll just follow standard translations. Administration means actually the city-state is governed and administered by the citizens. Now, set that against modern democracy, the problem, if you like, the source of the dissatisfaction with modern democracy is that we understand democracy by electoral competition and electoral representation. So insofar as democracy is power in the hands of the people, the Athenians had a particular idea. Insofar as democracy is electoral representation, there will always be complaints, and I think we can live with them, or to some extent I can live with them. Thank you for your attention. I'm done.
Thank you very much.
I am within the time limit. I did not want to go over. Happy to take questions. I may be able to answer some of them. I don't think that I can answer all of them.